Hey adventurers, so The Rings of Power has officially come out, the first 2 episodes, and I am filming this so it came out last night, I'm filming it on Friday, and this video will go up on Wednesday as kind of a looking back on these episodes in preparation for the next one. So the next episode of course comes out tomorrow night, and we will get right into my thoughts. So I guess we'll start it out this way. We'll start by going through episode 1, my thoughts on episode 1 as I was going through, and then after that we'll get into my thoughts on episode 2. I will say this as a introduction to both the episodes, I guess, to this whole review type video or thoughts type video, whatever it is, that when I watched episode 1, I ended up pausing it basically like almost every 30 seconds to a minute, just like or else pausing it to write something down, and just there was a lot going on that I had a lot of thoughts about. As it got farther into the episode, specifically the second half of episode 1, that kind of slowed down a little bit, and then episode 2 there wasn't hardly any of that, and that I paused the episode 2 once or twice to write things down because I had some thoughts or something like that, but it was not nearly the type of stuff that I had with episode 1. So what we'll do is I'll just go through the things that I wrote down in episode as I was going through the episode, and then we'll get into a little bit more of my thoughts on the show itself. This probably will contain, in fact I know it will contain spoilers, so this isn't a spoiler-free review. That's alright. So it starts out as a flashback, a narrative flashback. Galadriel of course is telling the flashback, and I like that. That's a good storytelling element, especially because it was so well done in Lord of the Rings films. So using that again here was a good choice, and I did like it. I think, and I'll get into this more in a little bit, but Morfydd Clark's Galadriel is very well done. So it starts out with them in Valinor, and we see a bunch of children elves, and they're playing and they're running around, and then they start fighting, which doesn't make sense to me because war and fighting hasn't come into existence yet in many ways. There's no violence yet, I guess is what I should say. Everything is still at this time. So why are the children fighting? That doesn't make any sense to me. Why there would be weapons? Why there'd be armor, stuff like that? Why the kids would be violent and fighting? That the elves are not a violent race as it is, and so why Galadriel is fighting doesn't really make sense to begin with. Also, again, I was just thinking about it because you see, I specifically noticed it at this point, but that's that all elf children have different lengths hair. All of them are like pretty short haired except Galadriel. She has long hair, which doesn't make sense because all the elf children, I mean of course Galadriel might be older than some of these other children or whatever, but the elves don't cut their hair. Why would they need to? That's not part of their culture. That's not something that they would need to do. So their hair would just continually grow or get to, and humans have a thing where yes, their hair grows at a different rate. That's true, but also there's a certain length that it gets to, and then it won't grow any longer than that for most humans anyways. And so it's like none of that's really important, but it's just a thing that kind of took me out of the truth of the world, because all the elf children had different length hair. If they all had the same length hair, even if it was all short, it would have made more sense. But then you see Finrod, and his hair is so distinctly cut in a certain style, and that makes me question why are the elves cutting their hair. And then another thing, because this is going to be, or at least this was a question earlier right at the beginning of all the stuff coming out about Rings of Power, is the black elf. Ismael Cruz Cordova is playing Arondir, who is a darker skin color. That doesn't bother me, it's fine, whatever. But it makes me question, why was there only white elves in Valinor? If we know later on down the road, a couple thousand years later, there's black elves, how come there are no black elves in Valinor? So it's just little things like, it doesn't quite make sense. That one's really not a big issue, but it was something that stood out to me, made me think about that. Okay, so then it gets into the conversation between Finrod and Galadriel, and he says, I won't always be here to speak them to you, talking about the truths. And then narrative Galadriel goes and says, we didn't have any word for death at that time, or something like that. And my first thought as soon as I heard that why I won't always be here to speak them to you, my first thought was, how does he know that he's gonna die? The elves have no knowledge of death at this time, and so how would he know that he wouldn't always be there for it? It's just something that stood out to me, and I was like, what is going on here? This doesn't make any sense at all. And then when it continues through the narrative and talks about the destruction of the two trees by Morgoth, which technically it was Morgoth and Ungoliant. It's specifically Ungoliant poisoning the two trees, and I mean at the behest of Morgoth, of course. But why was Ungoliant not mentioned there? Specifically because we know that Ungoliant is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. So why wouldn't she be mentioned in this show that only has access to The Lord of the Rings and the appendices? So it's just something that I'm like, guys, you could have mentioned Ungoliant and it would have made sense, and in fact you should have mentioned her. But maybe it's just something that Ungoliant's not going to be used in the show. There's nothing going to be referenced to her in the rest of the show, so why would they do that name drop just to do a name drop? And my reasoning would be because that's what Tolkien did. Tolkien did name drops all the time that he sometimes never got back around to fleshing out their stories. So I wouldn't have been opposed to them name dropping Ungoliant there. They used a different name for Middle-earth. It was known as Endor, but that isn't explained except in Silmarillion, so I can get past that. So again, in the narration, she's talking, we've left Valinor and went across the seas to a place called Middle-earth or something like that. And Middle-earth is definitely the more generic term, the more term that everybody's used to and knows the best. And so like I understand that. Also, Endor isn't used or in the Lord of the Rings, so I can understand that. It's just something that was like the elves would have called it Endor. It's fine. That one's not that big of an issue. Also, the way that it's shot, it makes it seem like they landed on Middle-earth and instantly the battles were, like very soon after their landing on Middle-earth, they were in massive battles with orcs. When it doesn't make sense for orcs to be around that early. It took a while for the orcs to be bred. They weren't just... So if the theory of them being corrupted elves is true, then it would have taken a while for Morgoth to corrupt the elves to the point where they would become orcs. If they were a new species, we know that Morgoth can't create, and so he had to only corrupt. So there's some questions as to, it can be explained by this is spanning thousands and thousands of years, not just this quick, it wasn't just immediate, but the way it was shot and filmed made it seem like it was very immediate. This also shows an image of a felbeast taking down an eagle, which is a cool looking image. When I saw it, I was like, oh, that's cool. But then as soon as I said that's cool, my thought change was like, wait a second, the felbeasts were bred specifically in the Third Age for the Nazgul. The felbeasts were not around in the First Age. They were specifically bred in the Third Age. That's another one where I was like, why not just use an actual dragon instead of specifically a felbeast? And why did they, again, make the felbeast look so much like the felbeasts from Peter Jackson's trilogy? So again, just little things that I'm like, no, not quite working. It also talks about Sauron being just a sorcerer, and Galadriel 100% knows that Sauron is not just a sorcerer, that he's a Maya, that he's a lesser angel, basically, or a fallen lesser angel, actually. But he's a very, very powerful being. He's far more than just a sorcerer. And I guess maybe in Lord of the Rings, it may be that in Lord of the Rings he's never referenced as a Maya. And so as such I can see, okay, well, what phrase did they use? And so I guess I can be okay with that, because they can't use the Silmarillion, which explains the whole Maiar and the Valar and everything like that. What else have I got? So there's no mention of the Silmarils at all in that narration, the flashback narration thing, which doesn't make sense because the Silmarils are such a major, they are the reason that the battles of the First Age exist in many ways. Of course, Morgoth destroying the trees and causing a bunch of stuff. That's another part of it, but the Silmarils also tie into that so intricately and so deeply that why they aren't mentioned in this flashback doesn't really make sense. Oh, okay, so then we're getting into the quest or the expedition that Galadriel is leading the elves on, and she says something about how the torch is not giving off any heat because of how evil it is or something like that. But that doesn't make sense. Again, I understand it could be cold enough. It could be so cold that the heat from a torch wouldn't be enough to hardly do anything. I understand that part. But she also says that the cold is so evil, or the evil is so cold that it blocks the heat from the torch, or whatever it is that she says, whatever the exact phrase is. And my first thought was, what about Balrogs? Balrogs are evil, but they're not cold at all. They're fire and shadow. Flame and shadow is what they're described as. So that would mean they're evil and hot. It doesn't make sense. Why is it that this is going on? Why are you using this terminology when it so clearly contradicts other things? It just little tiny things like this that were really getting me. And then, oh yes, Galadriel punches an ice wall. That's gonna hurt. It doesn't matter who you are. Punching a wall hurts, especially an ice wall. If you've ever punched ice, it hurts, or felt ice. It's solid. Plus that was easily an inch thick ice that she was punching. Just a little tiny hole that she had to hit with her hand, and it shattered in 2 punches, yeah, but it's still an ice wall, and that's gonna hurt. I don't even think she was wearing some sort of gauntlet. She must have been, but not really. I don't know. So that one, again, is just like, why are you punching an ice wall? And then the troll fight, the fight with the troll. The elves are literally just standing there, or sometimes like swinging a torch at the beast or whatever. The elves are elves. Why are they not putting up a fight against a troll? And then they all have to come in and be saved by Galadriel, which makes no sense. They're all elves. There was like 10 other elves besides Galadriel that could have easily just smashed that troll with all of them fighting together. The reason why it was done is because they had to show that Galadriel is the bestest of the best. But that doesn't make sense when she's leading an elite force of elves. The elitist force of elves in search of Sauron, who, if they can't fight even a troll, how are they supposed to fight Sauron if they find him? It didn't make sense, it didn't work, and you'll see a lot of other people complaining about this one as well. I already have seen it. So then we go to the Harfoots. I will most likely end up calling them hobbits because that's what they are. They're hobbits. Whether or not they're called that in this show, they're basically just hobbits. Yeah, they don't live in the Shire, but they're basically just hobbits. So the Harfoots are not supposed to be known to hardly be existing, and yet what do they call the 2 hunters are like, what, it's probably the Harfoots or something like that, and you're like, the Harfoots aren't supposed to be known to exist, and how do you know that they just little things that get me, like this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And this was just a question that came to my mind. So Nori and Poppy take a bunch of the other Harfoot children to a place with a bunch of berries, and as they're leaving it, you see an image or like a rock sitting in the background that looks like a pig's head. So I want to know what this pig's head is. It really doesn't affect anything, doesn't play into the story. It's just something that I noticed and I want to know more about. I did notice that a lot of the elven dialogue was pretty poor. When we were in Linden, the elves didn't talk like they were elves. They didn't have like a higher level of speech like we know them to have in Tolkien's works themselves, in the books themselves, but also in the Peter Jackson movies. The elves talk differently, and that wasn't really present in this, at least in this first episode. I did like the whole scene with Gil-galad giving the speech and Galadriel glancing over at Elrond and Elrond mouthing the speech that he had written for Gil-galad. I liked that scene. That was a good scene. So then we're getting into the Arondir and Bronwyn story. What is it? Methor is the elf's name, and he and Arondir are talking, and Methor mentions that there's only been 2 human and elf pairings in all of history, and both of them ended in tragedy and death, which is of course the reference to Erendil and Elwing, and then Beren and Luthien. And yes, Beren and Luthien absolutely ended in tragedy and death, but Erendil and Elwing didn't. That was, Erendil was given a Silmaril and told to sail the skies for the rest of eternity with Elwing at his side. So that's not really the same thing at all. Quick insert, because I just realized that I completely forgot that the other human-elf pairing in Middle-earth history is actually Tuor and Idril, not Erendil and Elwing. Erendil and Elwing were both half-elves, or considered half-elves. Idril is the daughter of Turgon, and Tuor is the son of Hur, who's the brother of Hurin, and that whole line of Hurin, and forget what their family name is, but that whole line of that whole human family there is very important to the lore of Middle-earth, and I completely forgot that that's who the other human-elf pairing was in history. So I did need to mention that and insert that because it's something that I completely forgot, but it's very important. And yes, that pairing definitely did end in death and tragedy. So they were right. Yeah, the Erendil and Elwing one doesn't really count, I guess. But yes, that is an important distinction, and I completely forgot it. So that one didn't really get me with the tragedy and death. I was very happy to see that those were mentioned, at least, because that the relation, or a love story between an elf and a human is so rare and so impossible that it basically doesn't happen. That's why Erendil and Elwing, Beren and Luthien, and Arwen and Aragorn are so important, is because they act as those bridges that really never happen. And I'm okay with the way that they're dealing with it so far in this show. We'll see if that continues, though. Of course, yeah. So then, when Arondir and Methor get back to the watchtower, somebody runs out and yells, "Medor, we have news," or something like that. And the way that it sounded when I first heard it was that he was saying Medor, which the writing is Medhor. That's the spelling of that name, but the pronunciation of DH in Tolkien's works is a th sound, and so it should be Medor. I had to go back and listen to it, and the second time I went back and listened to it, it did sound like they pronounced it correctly, but that first time it sounded incorrectly pronounced, and that was not something that they should have done. Anyways, let's continue. The elves seem to really hate humans in this show, at least the ones in Tir Harad. The men at the the elves at the watchtower seem to really hate humans, and I don't understand that, because the elves have a deep love for humans. They understand that humans often fail, they often are corrupted, stuff like that. There's a lot of issues that they have with them, but they're children of the Iluvatar, and they're very important, and the elves very much love them. So that didn't really ring true to me. Okay, so then we get into the sailing of the ship to the Undying Lands and Galadriel. They're all sitting there, they're all singing. I didn't mind some of what it was being portrayed with, like how the elves are supposed to have this knowledge of the song of the Undying Lands ingrained in their very being, and so I didn't mind how that was done. What I didn't like was the portrayal of the Undying Lands, and looking back now, the only portrayal of the Undying Lands that I liked was when when Finrod walked over that hill, and off in the distance you see Sirion, and then is it Sirion or Tyrion? I don't know. Sirion, I think, is what it's called, and then behind it, it's the two trees of Valinor. That shot is beautiful. That looks like Valinor to me, but the rest of it, with the whole cloud and then it opening up into light and everything, it didn't work for me, especially since at this point the Undying Lands wouldn't be hidden in that same way from all of Middle-earth, because you can still sail to the Undying Lands, even though, yeah, you can still sail to the Undying Lands at this point. We know that they do, because Ar-Pharazôn at the end of the Third Age, well, not quite the end, but before the sinking of Numenor, Ar-Pharazôn sails to the Undying Lands and lands on them, and it causes issues, and that's what makes them completely removed at that point. So I didn't like the way that the Undying Lands are kind of hidden from it. I don't know, I'm not loving the portrayal of the Undying Lands. So then the credits roll, and it says something about based on the Lord of the Rings and the appendices. That first episode is not. Very much not based on anything. That was very much created, everything in that episode was created for this show. And I understand that the show itself as a whole is supposed to be based on or taken from information given in the appendices. But it very much, that first episode was not, so that is just another thing that really stood out. What have I got? So the second half of the first episode was much stronger. The stuff not revolving around what we already know, meaning the stuff created for the show, is the strongest. So the stuff revolving around the Harfoots and Arondir is by far the strongest part of this show, and I kind of expected that. The Harfoots, I was questioning whether or not they would work. But then this second half of this first episode took the focus a little bit more away from Galadriel and gave it to these other storylines that are going to be important, and I thought that was stronger. The first episode was still really, really weak in my opinion. Okay, so then we get into the second episode, and there's only a couple things that I stopped and wrote down about the second episode. The first thing was that Celebrimbor and Elrond have this conversation, and then they just teleport and appear at Moria, as if they just took a leisurely stroll across, or from Eregion to Moria, and I'm like, no, they didn't. That's not just a leisurely stroll. That's a long walk. But they didn't hardly change any clothes. Like, Celebrimbor put a cloak on is all. They didn't have any supplies with them. They didn't have an entourage of any sort. It was literally just the two of them that they walked around a corner of a rock and they were at Moria, and that kind of didn't seem realistic. We also go into Moria, and there's a ton of female dwarves. I don't have any problem with female characters, but specifically within the lore of Tolkien, and I've mentioned this before, female dwarves are rare. There's not very many female dwarves. Not just named female dwarves, but actually the female dwarves are not very common. There's not very many. And so why there was more female dwarfs in Moria than there were male dwarfs, I'm not sure, and it doesn't really make sense. But other than that, so those are the two things that really stood out to me in episode 2 that it was just like, what? episode 2 was a lot stronger. Oh, also the conversation between Elrond and Celebrimbor, where Celebrimbor is talking about Fëanor in the Silmarils, and that whole conversation, and how the work of Fëanor nearly turned the Dark Lord himself, or whatever it was that he said. I really liked that. There was a lot of really cool stuff in that conversation, and that felt very true to Tolkien, in my opinion. Alright, so that's more or less my thoughts on the 2 episodes as I went through them. Here's some of the things that I specifically noticed I was liking. This section is specifically going to be about the characters. I'm liking Elrond so far. I suspected that I would, but Elrond's character is very fun to me. I'm really liking Elrond's character. It doesn't quite feel so much like the Elrond that we know from Lord of the Rings, but again, this is very much a younger Elrond, so that could change. I love Durin the Fourth. He's such a great character. His relationship with Elrond is hilarious. But dwarves oftentimes are just like great characters. The hobbits aren't as distracting and out of place as I thought they'd be, at least so far. So when in all the trailers, there was just something about the hobbits that felt wrong. Didn't feel like they should belong. And I still think that there shouldn't be hobbits in the Second Age. But the way they're portrayed, I don't mind it so much. It's not so distracting as I thought it would be. Morfydd Clark is doing very good at portraying the character written. Galadriel is frustrating though. So I really like Morfydd Clark's portrayal. I don't like the character. Galadriel is a very annoying character at the moment. Gil-galad is decent but needs more to work with, so I think Benjamin Walker is doing a very good Gil-galad. I think Gil-galad is very much the presence that he needs to be, but he needs a little bit more to work with. I don't feel like the writing for him has been as good as it needs to be. I like Arondir, and I like the whole watchtower thing, that there's a group of elves that are tasked with watching over Arondir, watching over Tirharad and the people who who in the past sided with Morgoth. I like that storyline. I like the way that it's being portrayed so far. I don't care for Bronwyn or Theo so far. Both of them are a little bit annoying. The portrayals are fine. I just don't like the characters and the personalities. Disa is fine as well. I was expecting to hate Disa just based on a lot of the things that the actress has said. Like, I was not expecting to think Disa a good character at all, but at least in this one episode that I've seen her in, she's fine. I don't mind her. Halbrand is very much of an Aragorn at the moment. We'll see what happens with him. That being an Aragorn from the movies, not from the books. But he's very much that rough, tough character who always seems to make the right choice and always seems to do the right thing type character. And I'm not sure that I like that, and he seems too good to be true at this point. With Aragorn, it makes sense for him to be that good, too good to be true, because that's Aragorn's personality. But with Halbrand, it doesn't, and I don't love that. But we'll see what happens with him. If he is a great character, then I'll be happy. If not, we'll see how it's done. And then the Stranger. I can't get it out of my mind that the Stranger is going to be Gandalf. He's got too many similarities. The way he talks to the Fireflies, his interactions with the hobbits, which would, just like everything about him screams, this is a wizard, this is Gandalf to me, and I don't like that. We'll see how it's done. If he doesn't turn out to be Gandalf, that'll be great. But so far, I'm not liking him as... I don't want it to be Gandalf, because that doesn't work. Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings talks about Gandalf, or in the appendices it talks about when Gandalf arrived in Middle-earth from a boat from the Undying Lands. He arrived, he talked to Círdan. He talked to Círdan, was given the Ring of Power by Círdan. So Gandalf should not be in Middle-earth yet. He arrives about 1,000 years, I think it's about 1,000 years into the Third Age. So he shouldn't be there. I like Celebrimbor. He's got a personality and a energy to him that I do quite like. Snow Troll. So that was one of the things that in the trailers, a lot of people commented on that were like the CGI for the Snow Troll doesn't look great. Finished CGI for the Snow Troll looks really good. I thought that it looked a lot better after watching the episode. And this is just another thing that popped up into my mind, is because I just finished Unfinished Tales, and it was talking about what the Southlands were in a section of it, and doesn't matter. Doesn't matter enough. But what they have marked on the Southlands for this show seems to be a little bit more limited than it should be. Southlands need to be a little bit more southern still. So it's not technically wrong, it's just a little bit limited. And I understand that we don't have more of the world. We don't have maps of more of the world, especially in the in Lord of the Rings. So what we have is what they've used, and it's fine. It's not that big of an issue. I already mentioned this. I don't love the portrayal of Valinor. It doesn't. The only thing that I've liked of Valinor was that coming over the hill and seeing the two trees. That shot I like. The rest of it, it doesn't really work for me. That's just me. Maybe the whole portrayal of Valinor, even from like the smoke covering it, opening up into a bright light, all that kind of stuff. Everything regarding Valinor hasn't worked except that shot of coming over the hill and seeing the two trees. Also, that talking about Valinor, the child elves running along the brook, playing in the stream, throwing rocks and stuff, that's all part of that. That doesn't work for me. Here's another thing. The relationship, the friendship between Galadriel and Elrond doesn't work. I want it to, but it doesn't really work for me, and I think it has largely to do with the fact that we're missing Celeborn and Celebrian. Celebrian is the wife of Elrond, so why isn't she around? Celeborn is the husband of Galadriel, why isn't he around? It doesn't work for me because of this gaping hole in these two characters' relationship. It's missing something, and that something is very noticeable. I would love to be able to see Galadriel as like an older friend who has a bit more experience to that type of character to Elrond, and they're trying to portray her as that, but it doesn't work because we're missing these two characters. It's blatantly apparent that there's a hole here in the relationship because Celeborn isn't around, because Celebrian isn't around. It's apparent, and I don't love that. I do love Khazad-dûm Moria. It's wonderfully well done. Yeah, pretty much all the stuff in Moria I really liked. I can't think of, nothing's coming to my mind off the top of my head of something that I didn't love about Moria, other than the excessive amount of female dwarves. Eregion, though the origins seem to be a little bit different from the books, it looks great and works well as well. The whole Celebrimbor and his I need you to build this forge by spring. It's so good. It works so good. But just the personality of Eregion, I'm liking that as well. And then Linden is absolutely beautiful. Those are just the things that I had written down for these first 2 episodes. How much of this will change going through the more of the series, I have no idea. We'll see when we get there. But that's just my thoughts for the moment. As to the storyline of the return of Sauron, the return of the darkness, and leading into the creation of the Rings of Power, all this kind of stuff, I'm liking that. I don't love Galadriel's storyline. Her storyline isn't working for me so far. And the other storylines, the Harfoot storyline, worked surprisingly better than I was expecting. The whole, the skies are strange line. In the trailers, they use that in every single trailer, and it didn't work in any of the trailers, but it worked in the show. And that's good. I do like Sadok Burrows, Harfoot, played by Sir Lenny Henry. I do like that character so far. I'm really not having an issue with the Harfoot storyline at the moment. We'll see if that changes again. Same with Arondir and Bronwyn, that storyline, I don't mind it. I don't care for Bronwyn or Theo yet, but I do like Arondir's storylines, especially so far. Elrond's storyline, the Dwarven storyline, all that stuff was working really, really well. I guess I do need to say this. There is a lot of it, though, that feels very much like generic fantasy, and that's bad. Tolkien is not generic fantasy. Yes, he's the father of modern high fantasy, but his is not generic. It's what everybody takes from to become generic fantasy. But when you read Tolkien's works, it's so different from generic fantasy. It's so much more in-depth, so much more unique. And so seeing the amount of just generic fantasy feeling to this show, I'm not loving it. So episode 1, I really, really didn't care for. Originally, I rated it a 6 of 10. Then after thinking about it for a little bit longer, I dropped that rating to a 4.4 out of 10, or 4.5 out of 10. It was this first episode was not good. Second episode was quite a bit better, probably 6.5 or 7 out of 10. So that's just kind of where I'm at. We'll see where the story continues to go. I don't know where they're going with this first season. I know the trailers have shown a lot. We're gonna get into some of the Numenor stuff in the next episode. So we'll see what I start thinking of that stuff, that storyline. So far, Galadriel's storyline isn't working. The rest of it seems to be okay. It's not as good as I wanted it to be, but it's also not as bad as I was expecting, other than that first episode that was really bad. So those are my thoughts on episodes 1 and 2 of The Rings of Power. This video is way longer than I wanted, but it's kind of what it has to be. Hopefully the next next episodes, my videos on the next episodes won't be nearly as long because I'll have a chance to, or I'll have set the groundwork with this episode, so I can just kind of go through and talk about the things that in those episodes that I liked. So that's where I'm at for the Rings of Power. Thank you guys for watching Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and if we have adaptation stuff, that's on a Wednesday. We will see you guys again soon. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Stay warm.